The box had been in my grandmother's attic for decades. After she passed away last spring, my mother and I spent weeks sorting through the remnants of her 94 years. It was in a dusty corner, beneath stacks of faded quilts and beside a trunk of wartime ration books, that we found it. A simple wooden box with tarnished brass hinges. "Family photographs," my mother said, brushing away cobwebs. "Mom always said she'd organize these someday." That night, after the moving truck had gone and the house stood half empty, we sat on the living room floor, sorting through the photographs. Most were familiar. My grandfather in his army uniform, my mother's childhood birthday parties, my own baby pictures. But at the bottom of the box lay a collection of much older photographs, their edges yellowed and curling. "I've never seen these before," my mother said, lifting a thick cardboard-backed photograph. "Look at the date." In faded ink across the back was written, "Christopher's baptism, May 12, 1918, First Baptist Church, Millfield." The photograph showed a solemn gathering outside a white wooden church. In the center, a young woman in a high-necked white dress held a baby wrapped in an elaborate christening gown. Beside her stood a tall man in a dark suit, his hand resting on her shoulder. A dozen other people formed a semicircle around them, their expressions uniformly grave. "That must be Great-Aunt Elizabeth," my mother said, pointing to the young woman, "and Great-Uncle Thomas, which would make the baby—" "Christopher," I finished, "the one who died." Christopher had been their only child. Family lore held that he had died of Spanish flu when he was barely a year old. Elizabeth had never recovered from the loss, spending the remainder of her life in a fog of grief, dying herself in 1927. I studied the photograph more closely, noticing something strange. "Mom, look at the baby." Christopher's tiny arm was extended, his finger pointing outward, not at his mother or father or any of the assembled relatives. He was pointing at what appeared to be empty space beside the group. "He's probably just waving his arm around," my mother said. "Babies do that." But there was something deliberate about the gesture. His finger was extended with purpose. His small face turned in the same direction. "Maybe," I said, but a chill had settled over me. I slipped the photograph into my bag, unable to explain why I felt compelled to keep it close. That night, in my hotel room, I examined the photograph again. In the dim light, shadows seemed to gather around the empty space where Christopher was pointing. I took a photo with my phone and zoomed in, searching for details I might have missed. And there it was, barely perceptible, a distortion in the background where no one stood, a smudge, perhaps, or a flaw in the developing process. But as I stared, it seemed to take form, the suggestion of a figure, tall and thin, standing apart from the family group. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of light, a damaged portion of the photograph. But I couldn't shake the sensation of something watching me through the decades-old image. I set the photograph face down on the nightstand and tried to sleep. In my dreams, I stood outside that white wooden church, watching as the family posed for their portrait. The baby turned its head, looking past them all, and smiled at something I couldn't see. The following morning, I drove back to my apartment in Boston with the baptism photograph secured in a folder. My academic curiosity was piqued. As a history professor specializing in early 20th century America, I had access to resources that might shed light on the photograph and the family captured within it. At my university's archive, I requested records from Millfield, Massachusetts, circa 1918. The archivist, Dana, raised an eyebrow. "Local history project?" she asked. "Family history," I replied. "My grandmother's family lived there." 3 hours later, I was surrounded by microfilm records of local newspapers, church registries, and census data. The First Baptist Church of Millfield had kept meticulous records, including a notation about Christopher Thomas Watson's baptism on May 12, 1918. Present were his parents, Thomas and Elizabeth Watson, along with various extended family members. The church bulletin mentioned that photographs were taken by Jeremiah Holcomb, a local photographer. I made a note of the name, wondering if any of his records might have survived. As I scrolled through the microfilm of the Millfield Gazette from May 1918, something caught my eye. A small article, dated May 14, 1918. Tragic accident claims local photographer Jeremiah Holcomb, 56, perished Monday evening when his automobile veered off Blackstone Road into Sawyers Creek. But Holcomb was returning from a baptism service at First Baptist Church, where he had been engaged to photograph the event. The cause of the accident remains unclear, though authorities speculate Mr. Holcomb may have swerved to avoid an animal in the roadway. He is survived by his wife, Margaret. May 13, 1918, the day after the baptism photograph was taken. I sat back, my skin prickling. The photographer had died immediately after taking the picture in my grandmother's attic. It could be coincidence, of course, but combined with the baby's strange pointing gesture, I returned to the census records, tracing the Watson family. Thomas had been a factory foreman at the Millfield Textiles Mill. Elizabeth was listed as homemaker. Christopher appeared in the 1920 census, but, as expected, was absent from the 1930 records. What caught my attention was an earlier census from 1910. Listed as a boarder in the Watson household was one Jeremiah Holcomb, photographer. He had lived with them. Before Christopher was born, before Thomas and Elizabeth were even married, the photographer had been part of their household. I found death records next. Jeremiah Holcomb died May 13, 1918. Cause of death, drowning. Christopher Watson died November 2, 1918. Cause of death, influenza. Elizabeth Watson died July 7, 1927. Cause of death, suicide. My hands trembled slightly as I made copies of everything I'd found. The connection between the photographer and the family seemed significant, but I couldn't pinpoint why. And that strange detail, the baby pointing at what appeared to be empty space in the photograph, taken by a man who would die hours later. As I gathered my materials, Dana approached with an ancient leather-bound book. "Found something you might be interested in," she said. "Parish records from First Baptist. There's a note about your family." She opened to a page marked with a slip of paper. There, in faded handwriting, was an entry dated May 12, 1918, baptism of Christopher Thomas Watson. Strange occurrence during ceremony. Child became agitated, crying and pointing. Mother claims child sees his guardian angel. Photographer Holcomb visibly disturbed by incident. That evening I spread my research materials across my dining table, the baptism photograph propped against a lamp. Something about the image continued to unsettle me. I found myself avoiding looking directly at it, as if afraid of what I might see. Using my phone, I enlarged the digital copy I'd made, focusing on the area where Christopher was pointing. The vague distortion remained visible, a smudge that could be interpreted as a tall, thin figure. But now, with my new knowledge, I wondered, was it meant to be Jeremiah Holcomb? I turned to my laptop and searched photography techniques from the early 20th century. Double exposures were common, sometimes accidental, sometimes deliberate artistic choices. Could that explain the distortion? But if Holcomb himself took the photograph, how could he appear in it, unless someone else had manipulated the photograph after his death? My phone rang, startling me. It was my mother. "I found more photographs," she said without preamble. "In a different box. There's another one from that baptism. Can you send me a picture of it?" "I'll do better than that. I'm in Boston for a conference. I can bring it to you tomorrow." After we hung up, I returned to my research, diving into newspaper archives. The Millfield Gazette had covered Jeremiah Holcomb's funeral. Among the mourners listed were Thomas and Elizabeth Watson, described as close friends of the deceased. No mention was made of Holcomb previously boarding with the family. I searched for earlier mentions of Holcomb in the newspaper. He had operated a photography studio in Millfield since 1895, specializing in family portraits and local events. In 1907, there was a small article about a fire at his original studio, after which he had apparently moved into boarding houses while rebuilding his business, including, according to the census, the Watson household. As night deepened, my eyes grew tired. I decided to take a break and make some tea. When I returned to the dining room, the baptism photograph had fallen face down on the table. I hesitated before turning it over. When I did, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A tiny inscription in the corner of the photograph. Using a magnifying glass, I made out the words, "I see you too." My heart began to race. Had that been there all along? It seemed impossible that I would have missed it. The handwriting was small but precise, nothing like the faded notation of the date on the back. I picked up my phone to call my mother, then stopped. It was after midnight. I didn't want to frighten her, and I had no explanation for what I'd found. Better to wait until morning, when she would arrive with the second photograph. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of my apartment building sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to elongate into the shape of a tall, thin man. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that my historical research had triggered an overactive imagination. But when I finally drifted off near dawn, I dreamed of Christopher again. This time he was older, perhaps 3 or 4, standing in a darkened room. He was still pointing, his small finger directed at me. "He sees you," the child said. "He always sees you." I awoke with a gasp as my alarm clock blared. Sunlight streamed through my windows, dispelling the fear that had gripped me in the night. In the rational light of day, the inscription on the photograph seemed less sinister, probably just a photographer's mark that I'd overlooked. My mother arrived at noon, carrying a small envelope. "I found this in a different box," she said. It was labeled Christopher's Baptism, second photograph. With a sense of trepidation, I opened the envelope. Inside was another photograph, similar to the first but taken from a slightly different angle. The same group stood outside the church, but in this image, Christopher was being held by his father rather than his mother, and he was still pointing. "It's strange, isn't it?" my mother said, frowning. "Why would he be pointing like that in both photos?" I compared the two photographs side by side. In both, Christopher's tiny finger was extended toward the same empty space beside the family group. But in this second photograph, the distortion I'd noticed was more pronounced. It was unmistakably the outline of a person. A tall man in what appeared to be a suit, standing apart from the others. "Mom, what do you know about Jeremiah Holcomb?" She looked surprised. "The photographer?" "Nothing really." "Why?" I explained what I'd discovered, how Holcomb had lived with Thomas and Elizabeth years before, how he died the day after taking these photographs, how Elizabeth had eventually taken her own life. "That's tragic." "But I don't see the connection," my mother said. "Look at where Christopher is pointing," I said, indicating the distortion. "I think there's someone there. Someone who wasn't visible to the family but somehow appeared in the photograph." My mother squinted at the image. "It's just a smudge, honey. These photographs are over 100 years old." "Then why is he pointing at it in both pictures? And look at this." I showed her the inscription I'd found. "I see you too." That's probably just the photographer's signature. But why those specific words? And why would Christopher be pointing at the same spot in 2 different photographs? My mother sighed. "You always had an active imagination. Even as a child, you'd create elaborate stories about the most ordinary things." I felt a flash of irritation. "This isn't imagination. There's something here, something connecting Holcomb to this family." "All right," she said placatingly. "What do you think happened?" I hesitated. Put into words, my suspicions sounded absurd. "I don't know exactly, but I think Christopher saw something, or someone, that the adults couldn't see, and somehow Holcomb captured it in these photographs." My mother started gathering her things. "I have to get to my conference. Why don't you take a break from this? You're getting too invested in what's probably just a family anecdote." After she left, I returned to my research with renewed determination. There had to be more to the story. I found death certificates for both Thomas and Elizabeth Watson. Thomas had died in 1945 of heart failure. Elizabeth's certificate confirmed suicide by drowning in the same creek where Jeremiah Holcomb had died 9 years earlier. That couldn't be coincidence. I searched property records next. After Thomas's death, their house in Millfield had been sold to a family named Grayson. Current records showed it was now owned by a historical preservation society listed as a local landmark. The Watson Holcomb House. Watson Holcomb House? Why would it bear both names? The Society's website offered a brief history. Built in 1890, this Queen Anne Victorian was home to Thomas and Elizabeth Watson. Local photographer Jeremiah Holcomb, a cousin of Elizabeth's, lived with the family intermittently and established his studio in the carriage house. After the tragic deaths of both Elizabeth and Jeremiah, Thomas Watson dedicated the property to preserving Holcomb's photographic legacy. A cousin. That explained the boarding arrangement, but not why this connection had been omitted from newspaper accounts, and certainly not why Christopher had pointed so deliberately at someone who wasn't visibly present. Unless... I pulled up the digital copies of both baptism photographs and enhanced them further, focusing on the distorted area. In the second photograph, the outline was clearer, tall, thin, with what appeared to be a photographer's case at his feet. A chill ran through me as a new theory formed. What if Holcomb had somehow included himself in the photographs? What if he had known he was going to die? The Watson Holcomb house was open for tours on weekends. The following Saturday, I made the drive to Millfield, a small town that had changed little in its historic centre since my grandmother's time. The house stood on a quiet street, lined with mature elm trees, a handsome Victorian with a wraparound porch and ornate gingerbread trim. A small sign indicated it was now a museum dedicated to early photography. A middle-aged woman greeted me in the foyer. "Welcome to the Watson Holcomb House. I'm Margaret Simmons, the curator. Are you interested in historical photography?" "Yes," I said, deciding not to reveal my family connection immediately, particularly the work of Jeremiah Holcomb. Her face brightened. "Then you've come to the right place. We have the largest collection of his work in existence. Are you a student of early photography?" "I'm a history professor," I explained. "I'm researching photography techniques from the early 20th century." "Fascinating period," she agreed. "Holcomb was innovative for his time. He experimented with multiple exposures, spirit photography, all sorts of techniques that were cutting edge for a small-town photographer." Spirit photography. The term caught my attention. "Did he believe in capturing images of the deceased?" Margaret laughed. "Like many photographers of his era, he catered to the spiritualist movement when it was profitable. Whether he believed in it himself is debatable. His journals suggest he was more interested in the technical challenges than the supernatural aspects. His journals survive. Oh, yes, we have his personal papers in our archives. His cousin Thomas Watson preserved everything after Jeremiah's death." She led me through the house, pointing out original furnishings and explaining the history of the property. The carriage house had been converted into Holcomb's studio after the fire that destroyed his original business premises. "This is where he developed his photographs," Margaret said, showing me a small windowless room with period equipment. "He was particularly known for his family portraits and commemorative photographs." "Like baptisms?" I asked. "Exactly. Religious ceremonies were a specialty of his. In fact, the last photograph he took before his death was a baptism." I took a deep breath. Christopher Watson's baptism. Margaret turned to me with surprise. "You know about that?" "Christopher was my great-uncle," I admitted. "I recently found photographs from his baptism in my grandmother's possessions." Her expression changed, becoming more guarded. "I see. Then you're a Watson descendant." "Yes. My grandmother was Thomas Watson's niece." Margaret seemed to consider something before speaking again. There's a part of the collection we don't usually show to the general public. But given your family connection, would you like to see Jeremiah's personal darkroom? I nodded, my heart beating faster. She led me to a door concealed behind a bookcase, unlocking it with a key from her pocket. This room has been preserved exactly as it was found after his death. Thomas Watson insisted nothing be moved. The small room beyond was cluttered with photographic equipment, chemical bottles, and stacks of glass negatives. The air smelled faintly of old chemicals despite the century that had passed. Along one wall, dozens of photographs were pinned, creating a macabre gallery. Each photograph showed the same phenomenon: ordinary family portraits or group settings, but with distinctive distortions or smudges where no one appeared to be standing. Jeremiah called these his visitations, Margaret explained. He believed he could capture images of entities that existed alongside us, invisible to the naked eye except to certain people, usually children or those near death. I moved closer to the photographs, noting the similarities to the baptism image. Did he manipulate these somehow? Double exposures, perhaps? That was Thomas Watson's theory after Jeremiah's death. But Jeremiah's journals tell a different story. She pulled a leather-bound book from a shelf. He believed he was photographing something real. Margaret handed me the journal, open to a page dated January 3rd, 1918. The visitor came again last night. Always at the edge of vision, never fully present. Elizabeth insists I forget these fantasies, as she calls them. But her child sees it too. I watched yesterday as little Christopher tracked something moving across the parlor with his eyes, something neither I nor his parents could see. When I asked Elizabeth about it, she became agitated and took the child upstairs. Thomas later suggested I find other lodgings, but I reminded him of our arrangement. He cannot break it now. I looked up from the journal. What arrangement? Margaret hesitated. The relationship between Jeremiah and the Watsons was complicated. They weren't actually cousins, though that's what they told people. Jeremiah and Elizabeth had been engaged before she met Thomas. When Thomas offered Elizabeth a more secure future, she broke off the engagement, but Jeremiah remained fixated on her. And they let him live with them, board with them. It wasn't by choice. Jeremiah possessed certain information about Thomas that could have ruined him socially and professionally. The nature of this information isn't clear from the journals, but it was evidently serious enough that Thomas allowed Jeremiah to remain in their lives. I turned the pages of the journal, finding an entry from April 1918. The visitor spoke to me today, not in words but in understanding. It has been watching the house, watching us, for reasons I cannot comprehend. I believe it means harm to the child. Elizabeth refuses to discuss it, though I know she has seen it too. I've observed her making warding gestures when entering Christopher's nursery. Thomas remains oblivious, concerned only with appearances and his precious position at the mill. He fails to see the danger surrounding his son. The next entry was dated May 11th, 1918, the day before Christopher's baptism. Tomorrow I will capture proof of the visitor's existence. I have prepared the camera and plates with the special emulsion that has shown promise in revealing what human eyes cannot see. If successful, even Thomas will be forced to acknowledge the threat. I fear time grows short. The visitor's presence strengthens daily. The final entry, written in a shaky hand, was dated May 12th, 1918, the day of the baptism. It knows. God help me, it knows what I've done. The baptism proceeded as planned, but Christopher saw it clearly, pointed directly at it standing among us. I captured the image, but in doing so, revealed my awareness. It followed me home. It stands in the corner of my darkroom as I write these words, watching. I cannot escape it now. There were no further entries. Jeremiah died the next day, Margaret said quietly. His automobile accident was initially ruled a tragic mishap, but the creek where he drowned was barely 4 feet deep, and Jeremiah was known to be a strong swimmer. Some speculated it wasn't an accident at all. "You mean suicide?" I asked. "Or something else?" His body, when recovered, showed unusual marks around the neck and wrists, as if he had been restrained. The official report attributed these to debris in the creek, but I thought of Elizabeth's suicide 9 years later in the same creek. What happened to the Watsons after Jeremiah's death? Thomas became obsessed with Jeremiah's photographs and journals. After Christopher died of influenza, Thomas converted the carriage house into a memorial of sorts, preserving Jeremiah's work and theories. Elizabeth grew increasingly unstable, claiming to see figures standing over Christopher's empty crib. She drowned herself in 1927. And Thomas? He lived here alone until his death in 1945, adding to the collection and researching what he called the phenomenon. He never remarried or had other children. I looked again at the wall of photographs, each with its distinctive smudge or distortion. "Do you believe any of this? That Jeremiah actually captured something supernatural?" Margaret smiled thinly. "I'm a historian, not a paranormal investigator. What I believe is that these three people, Jeremiah, Elizabeth, and Thomas, became consumed by something they couldn't explain. Whether it was grief, guilt, mental illness, or something genuinely uncanny is beyond my expertise to determine." She closed the journal and returned it to the shelf. "I will say this. In my 15 years curating this collection, I've never found evidence that Jeremiah manipulated these photographs. Whatever caused these distortions remains unexplained by conventional photographic techniques of the period." As we prepared to leave the darkroom, I noticed a photograph I hadn't seen before, partially hidden behind others on the wall. "What's that one?" Margaret carefully removed it from its pin. "This is unusual. It's the only photograph we have that shows Jeremiah himself." The photograph showed a tall, thin man standing beside a camera on a tripod. His face was solemn, his eyes intense beneath heavy brows. But what caught my attention was the background, a familiar white wooden church. First Baptist Church, Millfield. The setting of Christopher's baptism. And standing in the background, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a small, blurred figure that appeared to be pointing directly at the photographer. That night, in my hotel room in Millfield, I spread out copies of the materials Margaret had allowed me to photograph. Pages from Jeremiah's journal, newspaper clippings about his death and Elizabeth's suicide, and several of the visitation photographs from his collection. The baptism photographs, my copies from my grandmother's attic, I placed at the center of this makeshift investigation board. Something was missing from this narrative, some connection I couldn't quite grasp. I returned to the journal entries. Jeremiah had been preparing a special emulsion for the baptism photographs, one he believed would capture the presence of what he called the visitor. But who or what did he think this visitor was? Earlier entries provided clues. March 10th, 1918. The visitor appears most frequently at twilight. It stands motionless, observing. Elizabeth claims ignorance, but I've seen her watching the same empty corners, making the sign of the cross when she believes no one notices. March 23rd, 1918. Thomas found my photographic plates and demanded an explanation. I told him I was experimenting with new techniques. He threatened again to evict me, but fell silent when I mentioned the letters. He knows I have kept them safe all these years. April 17th, 1918. Christopher's behavior grows more concerning. He wakes screaming each night at precisely 3:17 a.m., his tiny arms outstretched toward the same corner of his nursery. Elizabeth has taken to sleeping in the rocking chair beside his crib. I offered to photograph the room during the night, but she refused, becoming hysterical. She knows what haunts this house. The narrative that emerged was disturbing. Jeremiah, still obsessed with Elizabeth years after their broken engagement, had used some form of blackmail to remain close to her, even after her marriage to Thomas and the birth of their son. He had become convinced that a supernatural entity, this visitor, was targeting the family, particularly the infant Christopher. But was this genuine concern, or the delusion of a disturbed mind? Jeremiah's fixation on Elizabeth suggested the latter, yet the photographs themselves presented a puzzle I couldn't easily dismiss. I examined the baptism photographs again, Christopher pointing at empty space. The strange distortion that resembled a tall figure, the inscription, "I see you too." If I accepted Jeremiah's account, Christopher had seen something that the adults could not, except perhaps for Jeremiah himself. The photographer had then captured this entity on film, using his special techniques. And then, the day after taking these photographs, Jeremiah had died under suspicious circumstances. 9 years later, Elizabeth had taken her own life in the same location. I turned to the newspaper account of Elizabeth's suicide. The article mentioned that she had left a note, but its contents were not disclosed, out of respect for the family. I wondered if that note still existed somewhere among the Watson Holcombe House archives. A detail in one of the photographs caught my eye, a small pendant Elizabeth wore at her throat. Using a magnifying app on my phone, I enlarged the image. The pendant appeared to be an antique locket, oval-shaped with an ornate design. In the photograph of Jeremiah standing beside his camera, a watch chain was visible, extending from his vest pocket. Attached to it was what looked like the same locket. I checked the time, past midnight. Too late to call Margaret with questions. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was close to understanding something important about these long-dead people and the strange circumstances surrounding them. As I prepared for bed, I noticed something unsettling. The baptism photograph I'd placed on the nightstand had shifted position. Instead of facing the wall as I'd left it, it now faced outward, Christopher's tiny pointing finger aimed directly at my bed. I told myself I must have moved it without thinking, but as I turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, I couldn't escape the sensation of being watched. In the darkness, I whispered, "What did you see, Christopher?" No answer came, but as I drifted towards sleep, the air in the corner of the room seemed to thicken, to gather substance like a developing photograph. I woke with a start at exactly 3:17 a.m., the time Jeremiah had noted in his journal when Christopher would wake screaming. For a disorienting moment, I thought I saw a tall figure standing in the corner of my hotel room, but when I fumbled for the lamp switch, the room was empty. Unable to return to sleep, I reviewed my notes until dawn. When morning finally came, I called Margaret as soon as I thought reasonable. "I need to ask you about Elizabeth's suicide note," I said without preamble when she answered. There was a pause before she replied. "That's not something we discuss with visitors." "I'm family," I reminded her, "and I think it's connected to Jeremiah's death and these photographs." Another long pause. "Meet me at the house in an hour." When I arrived, Margaret was waiting on the porch, her expression grave. "I've been the curator here for 15 years, she said as she unlocked the door. "In that time, only 3 other Watson descendants have visited. None asked about Elizabeth's note. She led me not to the darkroom this time, but to a small office off the main hallway. From a filing cabinet, she removed a folder marked Personal Correspondence, Restricted. Thomas Watson sealed these documents with instructions they remained private for 100 years after Elizabeth's death. Technically, that's still 22 years away. But given your research and family connection..." She placed a yellowed envelope on the desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting slanted and frantic. "Thomas, it has returned for me, as I always knew it would. Jeremiah was right about everything. He tried to capture it, to prove its existence, but in doing so he drew its attention. It took him first, but it never left us. I see it standing over Christopher's empty crib each night. It wears Jeremiah's face now, but it is not him. It has been waiting, biding its time. 9 years of torment. The locket was the connection. I should have destroyed it years ago, but it was all I had left of my son. Now I understand. It used the locket to bind us all. Jeremiah, Christopher, myself. a trinity of grief. By the time you read this, I will have joined them. Perhaps in death I can protect you as I failed to protect our son. Burn the photographs, all of them. Elizabeth. I looked up from the letter, my mouth dry. The locket, Margaret nodded. Thomas mentioned it in his own journals. It originally belonged to Elizabeth's grandmother. She gave it to Jeremiah during their engagement, then asked for it back when she broke things off to marry Thomas. Jeremiah refused. After Christopher was born, Jeremiah presented the locket to Elizabeth as a christening gift for the baby. A peace offering, he claimed. And Elizabeth accepted it? According to Thomas, she was reluctant, but Jeremiah insisted. He had apparently modified it somehow, added something to it. Thomas described it as that damned trinket that brought ruin to us all. Where is it now? Margaret's expression tightened. That's the thing. It was buried with Elizabeth. Or it was supposed to be, but when Thomas had her grave relocated to the family plot in 1930, the locket wasn't with her remains. Could it have been stolen? Possibly, or Thomas might have removed it himself, though he denied doing so. It's never been found. I thought of the inscription on the baptism photograph. I see you too. These photographs, I said, pulling out my copies from my bag. Did Jeremiah really believe he was capturing a supernatural entity, or was he creating some elaborate hoax to torment Elizabeth and Thomas? Margaret considered the question. Based on his journals and Thomas's subsequent research, I believe Jeremiah genuinely thought he was documenting something real. Whether it was real or a product of his disturbed mind is impossible to determine now. And the baby, Christopher consistently pointing at something no one else could see. Children have always been associated with heightened sensitivity to the paranormal in folklore, Margaret said. But there's another possibility. Jeremiah might have been using some visual cue off camera to direct the child's attention, then creating the distortion in development to match where Christopher pointed. It was a rational explanation, one that aligned with known photographic techniques of the era. Yet it failed to account for Elizabeth's deteriorating mental state after Jeremiah's death, or her suicide note's frantic claims about something returning for her. What happened to Christopher, I asked. His death certificate said influenza, but... The Spanish flu pandemic was devastating that year, Margaret confirmed. There's no reason to doubt that as his cause of death. Thomas's journals describe the progression of the illness, fever, difficulty breathing, the blue tinge to his skin characteristic of that particular strain. The doctor confirmed it as influenza. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that Christopher's death, coming just 6 months after Jeremiah's, was somehow connected to whatever had been happening in that house. I'd like to see Thomas's journals, I said. Margaret hesitated. Those are even more restricted than Elizabeth's letters. He explicitly requested they remain sealed until 2027, a century after Elizabeth's death. But please, I said, I need to understand what happened to my family. She studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. Wait here. Thomas Watson's journal was bound in dark leather, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Unlike Jeremiah's feverish accounts or Elizabeth's frantic final note, Thomas wrote with the detached precision of a scientist documenting experiments. The earliest entry Margaret showed me was dated May 14, 1918, the day after Jeremiah's death. Holcomb's funeral arrangements have been made. Elizabeth refuses to attend, claiming it would be tempting fate. Her superstitions grow tiresome, yet I cannot deny there was something unusual about the baptism photographs Holcomb took. The distortion appears in both sets of prints, corresponding exactly to where Christopher was pointing. I have examined the negatives carefully and can find no evidence of manipulation, though Holcomb was skilled enough to conceal such tricks. Drew entries through the summer of 1918 documented Thomas's growing fascination with Jeremiah's photographic techniques, even as he maintained skepticism about their supposedly supernatural elements. August 3, 1918. I have recreated Holcomb's special emulsion using his notes. The chemical mixture is unusual, but not unprecedented in photographic circles. My test photographs show similar distortions to his visitations, though less pronounced. Elizabeth became hysterical when she discovered my experiments and demanded I destroy everything. For her peace of mind, I agreed, though I have merely relocated the materials to my office at the mill. October 17th, 1918. Christopher has been feverish for 2 days. The doctor diagnosed influenza and recommended isolation. Half the town is ill with this Spanish plague. Elizabeth refuses to leave his side, though I've warned her of contagion. She whispers constantly to him, prayers mixed with strange phrases I cannot decipher. Twice, I've found her sleeping with Holcomb's locket clutched in her hand, though she denies touching it when confronted. October 30th, 1918. Christopher's condition worsens. His breathing is labored, his small face tinged blue. Elizabeth claims she sees Holcomb standing in the corner of the nursery, watching. I have tried to reason with her, explaining that grief and exhaustion are causing hallucinations, but she grows only more insistent. Today she screamed that it was bending over Christopher's crib. When I saw nothing, she struck me, accusing me of willful blindness. November 2nd, 1918. My son is gone. The doctor says he fought valiantly, but the influenza was too severe. Elizabeth is catatonic with grief. She will not release his body, insisting he is still present. I fear for her sanity. Late tonight, I found her in the nursery, speaking to the empty crib, as if Christopher still occupied it. When I approached, she turned with such hatred in her eyes that I scarcely recognized her. "You let it take him," she said. "You and your pride." The entries that followed chronicled Elizabeth's descent into what Thomas described as melancholia complicated by delusions. She claimed to see Christopher throughout the house, always pointing at something behind Thomas. She insisted on keeping his nursery exactly as it had been, refusing to pack away his clothes or toys, and always there was the locket. December 25th, 1918. Elizabeth wore the locket to Christmas service. When I questioned this, she said Christopher wanted her to wear it. She speaks of him in present tense, as if he still lives. The neighbors have begun to talk. My position at the mill grows precarious as rumors of Elizabeth's condition spread. The entries became sporadic through the following years, documenting Elizabeth's brief improvements and subsequent relapses. Thomas described consulting numerous physicians, trying various treatments fashionable at the time, rest cures, hydrotherapy, even primitive electroshock therapy, at one desperate point. Throughout it all, Elizabeth maintained that Jeremiah had discovered something real, something that had taken first him, then Christopher, and would eventually come for her. May 12th, 1927. 9 years since Christopher's baptism. Elizabeth insisted on visiting the church today, the first time she has left the house voluntarily in months. She seemed almost peaceful, touching the stone font where Christopher had been baptized. On the way home, she asked to stop at Sawyer's Creek, where Holcomb's automobile went off the road. I should have refused. This was the last entry before Elizabeth's suicide on July 7th, 1927. The subsequent pages detailed Thomas's grief, his guilt, and his growing obsession with understanding what had happened to his family. He began collecting Jeremiah's photographs from various clients around town, offering generous sums for what he called examples of Holcomb's special technique. He converted the carriage house into a research space, meticulously cataloguing each photograph and noting the distortions present. Most disturbing were his later entries, when his scientific skepticism began to waver. March 17th, 1930. I have seen it. After 12 years of dismissing Elizabeth's claims, I have seen what she described. It stood at the foot of my bed last night, tall and thin with Holcomb's face, but somehow wrong, the proportions distorted, the eyes too large and dark. It said nothing, merely watched. I convinced myself it was a dream until morning, when I found wet footprints leading from my bedroom to Christopher's old nursery. The room was undisturbed, except for one detail. The christening gown, preserved in a cedar chest all these years, had been removed and laid across the crib. Thomas's final journal entry, dated June 30th, 1945, just 2 weeks before his death, read simply, "It's patient." All these years, I thought I had escaped its attention, but it was merely waiting. Elizabeth was right about everything. The locket is the key. Holcomb did something to it, used it somehow. I've searched for it for 18 years, since it disappeared from Elizabeth's grave. Now I know where it's been all along. It has shown me. Too late for warnings. Those who come after must discover the truth themselves. God forgive us all. I looked up from the journal, meeting Margaret's solemn gaze. "His death certificate says heart failure," she said quietly, but the housekeeper who found him reported that his face was frozen in an expression of extreme terror, his hands clutched at his throat as if fighting to breathe. And the locket was never found. Never. The house has been thoroughly renovated over the decades, as it passed from owner to owner before becoming a museum. If it was hidden somewhere on the property, it would likely have been discovered. I thought of the baptism photographs, still in my bag. Christopher pointing at something no one else could see. The inscription, "I see you too." "What do you think happened to this family?" I asked. Margaret closed Thomas's journal carefully. "As a historian, I can only say that they experienced a series of tragic events: the death of a friend, the loss of a child, the suicide of a grieving mother, all within the context of the post-war period and the Spanish flu pandemic. These were traumatic times." "And as something other than a historian?" She met my eyes steadily. "I've spent 15 years with these journals, photographs, and artifacts. I've catalogued every item in this house, read every letter and document, and there are nights when I don't stay in this building past sunset. Take from that what you will." As I prepared to leave, Margaret handed me a small envelope. This was with Thomas's personal effects. The notation indicates it was to be given to any Watson descendant who inquired specifically about the baptism photographs. Inside was a single slip of paper with an address in Millfield Cemetery and the words, "The truth lies with them." Millfield Cemetery occupied a hillside overlooking the town, its oldest sections dating back to colonial times. The caretaker directed me to the Watson family plot, located beneath a sprawling oak tree near the eastern edge. The family monument was substantial, a granite obelisk inscribed with the Watson name surrounded by individual markers. Thomas and Elizabeth lay side by side, their headstones simple and dignified. A smaller stone marked Christopher's grave, adorned with a carved cherub. I stood before them, uncertain what I was meant to find. Thomas's cryptic note, "The truth lies with them," suggested some evidence or explanation was here, but nothing seemed unusual about the well-maintained plot. As I circled the monument, I noticed something odd about Christopher's headstone. Unlike the others, which were flush with the ground, his appeared to sit slightly elevated, as if the earth beneath had shifted. Kneeling beside it, I saw that the stone had indeed been disturbed. Recent rains had eroded the soil around one edge, revealing what looked like a small metal box, partially buried beneath the marker. I hesitated, aware that disturbing a grave was both illegal and disrespectful, but Thomas's message had directed me here specifically, and the partially exposed box seemed deliberate rather than accidental. Using a stick, I carefully excavated around the box without displacing the headstone. It came free with surprising ease, suggesting it had been placed there relatively recently, not when the grave was originally created over a century ago. The box was made of copper, now green with patina. No lock secured it, just a simple hinged lid. Inside, nestled in deteriorating velvet, lay an oval locket on a tarnished silver chain. My breath caught. The locket from the photographs. The one Elizabeth had worn at Christopher's baptism, the one Jeremiah had carried on his watch chain, the one that had supposedly disappeared from Elizabeth's grave. Beside it was a folded note in Thomas's handwriting. To whoever finds this, I have returned the locket to the only place it can do no further harm, with those already taken. Do not remove it. Do not open it. The chain that binds them must not be broken again. Despite this warning, my fingers moved toward the locket. Its surface was engraved with an intricate pattern of intertwining vines, tarnished with age, but still beautiful. The craftsmanship was exceptional, clearly from another era. My thumb found the small clasp at its side. It resisted slightly, then yielded with a soft click. Inside were 2 miniature photographs, expertly cut to fit the oval frames. On the left was an image of Jeremiah Holcomb, his solemn expression the same as in the photograph I'd seen at the house. On the right was a photograph of an infant, Christopher presumably, but something was wrong with Christopher's image. Where his eyes should have been were 2 small, dark voids, as if the photograph had been deliberately damaged, and in the background, barely visible, was the suggestion of a tall, thin figure standing behind him. As I stared at the locket, a shadow fell across me. I looked up, expecting to see a cloud passing over the sun, but the sky remained clear. The shadow seemed to emanate from nowhere, stretching across the graves before me. I closed the locket quickly, my heart racing. The shadow receded as suddenly as it had appeared. From the direction of the cemetery entrance, I heard voices, a family approaching to visit a nearby grave. I slipped the locket and note back into the box and returned it to its hiding place, carefully replacing the disturbed soil around Christopher's headstone. As I stood to leave, I noticed something I'd overlooked before. Engraved at the base of Christopher's headstone, nearly obscured by moss and time, were the words, "He saw what others could not." That evening, as my train carried me back to Boston, I reviewed everything I had learned. Jeremiah Holcomb, obsessed with his former fiancée, had used blackmail to remain close to her family. He had become convinced that some supernatural entity was targeting them, particularly the infant Christopher. Using experimental photographic techniques, he had attempted to capture evidence of this entity. The day after taking the baptism photographs, Jeremiah had died in suspicious circumstances. 6 months later, Christopher had succumbed to influenza. 9 years after that, Elizabeth had taken her own life in the same location where Jeremiah had died. And Thomas, after decades of skepticism, had apparently come to believe their claims shortly before his own death. Central to it all was the locket, a gift from Elizabeth to Jeremiah, returned to her as a christening present for Christopher, then disappeared from her grave, only to be hidden by Thomas beneath their son's headstone with an ominous warning. Rational explanations existed. Jeremiah could have been mentally unstable, his visitations nothing more than photographic tricks designed to manipulate Elizabeth. Elizabeth's subsequent decline could be attributed to grief over losing her child, exacerbated by guilt over Jeremiah's death. Thomas's later beliefs could be the product of his own grief and isolation. Yet the photographs themselves remained unexplained. Christopher pointing at something no one else could see, the distortion that resembled a human figure, the inscription, "I see you too." As my train pulled into Boston, I made a decision. The baptism photographs would remain in my files, objects of historical interest, but nothing more. I would document what I had learned for academic purposes, but I would not pursue the mystery further. Some family secrets, I decided, were best left buried. That night, I dreamed of a small boy standing in a white christening gown. He was pointing, not at something behind me, but at me directly. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I woke with a start, my apartment dark and silent. For a moment, I thought I saw a tall figure standing in the corner of my bedroom, but when I turned on the lamp, nothing was there. On my desk, the baptism photograph lay face up, though I was certain I had placed it in a folder before sleeping. Christopher's tiny finger pointed outward, towards something only he could see, or perhaps towards something he wanted me to see. I remembered Thomas's final journal entry, Those who come after must discover the truth themselves. And Elizabeth's frantic warning, burn the photographs, all of them. I picked up the photograph, studying it one last time. The baby's solemn face, the pointing finger, the distortion where no one stood. In the corner of the image, the inscription remained, "I see you too." I placed the photograph back in its folder and sealed it inside an envelope, which I then locked in my desk drawer. Some questions, I decided, were better left unanswered. Some truths too dangerous to pursue. But as I turned away, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched by something that had waited patiently for over a century, something that had found me through a photograph in my grandmother's attic, something that now knew I had seen it too.